Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Steve Donovan, the Director of Alumni Relations at Trinity College. It's my pleasure to welcome you back, so to speak, for your reunion. While we so wish we could be doing this on the beautiful quad and in beloved classrooms along the Long Walk, the world is just not quite ready for that. I promise you, we are very eager to bring alumni together again in person, both on campus and throughout the world, and it's our hope that we will begin that this fall. Today, we're pleased that you have joined us virtually and hope you'll find the weekend's array of class-specific gatherings and college-offered presentations, which will celebrate accomplished alumni. We hope you'll find them enjoyable, informative, and inspirational. The alumni volunteers who help us plan your reunions often ask for a state of the college type of address from the president. President Berger Sweeney is always happy to do that and will on Sunday. Many of you know that the president's formal title, or some of you at least will know that her formal title is the president and Trinity College Professor of Neuroscience. And this weekend she asked us if she could wear that other hat as well for a little while. And because she's the president, we of course said yes. Trinity is fortunate to have one of the finest undergraduate neuroscience programs in the country, and I'm delighted to now be able to introduce an accomplished alumnus of that program who has agreed to moderate today's program. Dr. Arko Ghosh graduated with honors from Trinity in 2004 with a BS in neuroscience. He earned his PhD in natural sciences in 2009 at ETH Zurich, the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, where he received the ETH Medal for Outstanding Doctoral Thesis. He's held research positions at Yale, ETH Zurich, and University College London. Today, Arko is a tenured assistant professor of cognitive psychology at Leiden University in the Netherlands, where he leads the Cognition in Digital Environment Laboratory. There he studies how the human brain generates day-to-day behavior. His lab holds the largest academic database of smartphone behavior in conjunction with brain activity measurements in the world. The team is currently engaged in discovering real-world behavioral markers for sleep, aging, stroke, epilepsy, and migraines. Arko's projects have been featured by worldwide press, including the BBC, Wired, New Scientist, Business Insider, and Reuters, and he also holds 3 patents. I'll stop there and say how delighted we are to welcome Arko back to Trinity and turn the program over to him in the Netherlands, where it's already Friday evening. Thank you, Arko.
Hi. Good evening, everyone, and good afternoon to the guys in the US. So it is really my pleasure to be with all of you today and from Netherlands. And now to give this session an introduction and to give Joanne an introduction, I would like to depend on memory. So my first time that I actually saw Professor Joanne Berger Sweeney was actually at a neuroscience meeting, which is the Society for Neuroscience meeting, one of the largest gathering of neuroscientists in the world. And there she was with a few undergraduate researchers from Trinity at a restaurant, kind of sharing, having, and enjoying their dinner. And that simple moment, for those taking notes, that would be episodic memory. So, but that simple moment in time really struck me, because that really captures everything I associate with Trinity, a place where accomplished scientists act as professors and take their students so seriously so as to join the students' academic journey. Now, Professor Berger Sweeney is a highly accomplished neuroscientist, and that too, right from the onset of her scientific career. She obtained her PhD at Johns Hopkins under the guidance of a well-known neuroscientist, Joseph Coyle. And already at this early stage of her career, she helped identify and characterize really novel pathways that play a role in learning and memory. Now, her contribution was really rigorous. Several years after her thesis at Johns Hopkins, she was still chasing these pathways and even developed a rather clever neurotoxin, which could be used to selectively shut them down in order to study the role of these novel pathways in memory. In effect, in her laboratory, the mice could no longer recall where they had just been under the influence of Joanne's toxin. Perhaps some of us may even relate to that toxicated neurine experience. Now, even while shaping the area of learning and memory with her experiments, Joanne ensured her work was accessible. I mean, while exploring the different model systems to study the brain, she did author a report entitled Mice Are Not Little Rats. Who would not want to read that? Professor Joanne Berger-Sweeney, I look forward to hearing your accessible take on one of the greatest mysteries of the brain, that is memory.
Oh, thank you very much for that warm introduction, Arco. And I can't wait till we get to the end of my relatively short presentation, because as I said, I expect that you're going to be able to answer as many of the questions that people have as I do. And I think it will be wonderful to highlight you at the same time when I'm trying to answer and share information. So thank you for that very warm introduction. And I hope that we get a chance to back and forth a little bit, because before any of you joined us, we actually started to find a lot of things in common in our background. So with that, I will begin and say thank you. Now, I had a big goal when I put forward this presentation. And I think even in the short write-up that you have, I promised that by the end of this lecture, you would be smarter. So you all are going to help keep me honest and tell me if by the end of this lecture, you know things that you didn't know or understand about learning and memory, and if you feel just a little bit smarter because of it. If I can have the first slide. Okay, terrific. So I entitled this particular lecture, as well as my course, The Art and Science of Memory. How do we remember? So just for a little bit of background, I think many of you realize that it was an unusual year last year. And we reorganized the academic calendar. We had a fall and spring semester, but in between, we had a January term that was 5 weeks long, which actually I think it extended into the first week of February, and all of the courses were online. And so for the first time since I've been here at Trinity, I decided I can teach a course. So I decided, I heard that that they weren't sure that, the dean of faculty office, that there were enough courses. And I said, well, what are you missing? And they said, courses for sophomores. So I decided to design this course pretty much specifically as a sophomore seminar. And I allowed people from any background to come into the course and to learn something about how we remember. If you can click forward, Bonnie, the next, it really is just showing my, title. Thank you, President. And, I'm a neuroscientist by training. So when I decided that I was going to teach a course, I realized that, I'm president, I need backup. So what better backup could I find than my husband, who is also a neuroscientist? So here I am on the left, and here's my husband on the right, Urs Berger, who was teaching assistant for this course. Now, his specialty in neuroscience isn't learning and memory, but I said, you will understand enough to be able to TA this course. And he asked me, do I have a choice as to whether I TA or not? And I said, no, you don't. So he was my TA, and I could not have asked for a better TA. If I can have the next slide, please. So what I want to do is share with you a little bit, or just give you a flavor of some of the things that my sophomores were learning about learning and memory. And we started with this book that's entitled Moonwalking with Einstein by Joshua Forer. And I will tell you a little bit more, next slide please, about the book and how we think about memory these days. So this book, Moonwalking with Einstein, starts with this particular incident. Simonides of Chios, from 5th century BC Greece, was known for giving long recitations. They could be longer than an hour, and they were poems that he would not have a single note, but followed the full text of a poem or a recitation that he was giving. So he was invited to lots of parties of noblemen. So he had been invited to a party and just had finished one of his recitations when someone tapped him on the shoulder and said, "We need you immediately, outside, because a messenger has a message for you." So he got up and he left the banquet hall. The moment at which he left the banquet hall, the full ceiling collapsed, the marble ceiling and the columns, and it killed everyone that was in the banquet room. But because it had been a disaster in which ceilings and columns were falling, when family members began to arrive, because they heard that everyone in the collapsed building had died, it was adding a layer on top of their distress, because there was no idea who was where and where they might be able to find the effects of their loved ones. So as I said, it felt like a tragedy compounded upon a tragedy. And there were certainly, more than 50 people in the room. So it was just a calamity. And apparently, or according to legend, Simonides stopped, closed off his mind, and just thought and envisioned what he had seen before he had been pulled out of the room. And apparently, he took every family member and said, "Here, this is where your loved one was sitting. So if you're looking for effects, look here." And he went, and for each and every person in the room, he identified for the family where they were. What an incredible feat. And many people talk about the art of memory and the idea that you can memorize incredible amounts of knowledge. And it was really, we kind of identify it back to Simonides and this incident where he could identify, by closing off his mind, each and every person and exactly where they were sitting to help the loved ones identify their family members. Next slide, please. So this is the way that Josh Forer, who was a reporter, a science reporter, and he decided that he was going to cover the memory championship. Now we're back to, kind of modern times. And he went to this memory championship that occurred in New York City. And people are sitting there memorizing, multiple decks of cards in exact order. And he wanted to understand how this was happening. So he decided to put himself to the test. And people were saying, who were memory champions, our memories are not extraordinary, but we practice. So he decided that he was going to practice using the techniques that these memory champions used. And by the end of the book, what you discover is that Josh goes from just ordinary reporter to actually winning the U.S. Memory Championship. And one of the ways that he did this was by learning and training his memory a bit better and using something that people refer to as a memory palace. And that is, if you have a series of things that you want to remember, associations that you want to make, sometimes you can wall yourself off and think about them as different rooms in a palace. So you walk through the front door, you see Cookie Monster, and that reminds you of something. You go into the kitchen and you see Britney Spears, and that reminds you of another piece of this long recitation that you are trying to memorize. And using these techniques and practicing for a full year, he actually was able to become memory champion of the US, even though he noted that his memory he thought was quite ordinary. If I can have the next slide, please. So I am going to ask you, in order that we make sure that this is interactive, if you know how to use the chat function here in Zoom, I'm going to ask you to answer some of these questions in the chat function. So I'll give you a second to pull up the chat function, in which you should be, I hope that you will be able to, actually, given what this is, it might be in the Q&A function, not in the chat function. So I ask you to click on, at the bottom of your Zoom, the Q&A, and let's see if we're able to see questions that people ask. So my question to you is, do you think that you would be capable of memorizing an entire book? My guess is most people think the answer is no. But I think with practice, yep, I'm starting to see a few no's come in my Q&A function. No exclamation point is what I'm finding. And most people think that they could not. But if you read this book, you will realize that you have the capacity to memorize a lot more than you think by making associations and giving attention to memory. One of the things, therefore, that Josh Forer says is that great memories are learned. They aren't just, you were born with a great memory or not. You actually can train and improve your memory by giving it some attention. He also talks in the book about how much we are externalizing our memory right now with Googles and the internet, where we aren't trying to memorize things anymore because we're just fine looking and answering and finding the question and answer on Google, rather than using and training our memories. And one of the statements that he makes in the book, and that many people think, is that our lives is really, it's a sum of our memories. So isn't it worth spending some time and paying some attention and to what people are saying to you? Because if you pay attention and focus, you actually can improve your memory and memorize more things that people share with you. If I can have the next slide, please. So, like any good professor, I want to start with a couple of definitions. So here are definitions of learning and memory. The first thing I want to share with you is that learning and memory are theoretical concepts. You have actually never seen memory, and you've never seen learning. What you see is behavioral output that suggests that the organism has acquired new information. So learning is the process of acquiring new information, while memory refers to the persistence of the learning in a state that can be revealed at a later time. Learning is a long-lasting change in behavior as a result of experience. And you can read there also about memory. One of the things that we understand now about memory is that it does have a basis in the brain. And there are different memory systems that seem to be associated with different parts of the brain. We don't have time to go into all of these details. So I'm just going to talk generically about learning and memory as if there's one kind. But if you were in my course, you'd realize that there are actually different kinds of memory and different brain regions associated with those different kinds of memory. Memory is made up of encoding or acquiring the information, storing it in some manner, and then retrieving or recalling it at some later point in time. If I can ask for the next slide, please. So what I shared with my students is that you can approach memory, I say, from a psychological point of view in which there's an experience, and then the psychologist characterizes very often the kinds of behavioral outputs and changes and quantifies those to a very fine degree. A bit more of a neurobiological approach is that there's an experience and there are brain systems and cells within the brain that are associated with, if you want to think of, kind of acquiring and storing the memory. And sometimes us neuroscientists aren't quite as sophisticated as psychologists as defining some of those very specific behaviors that allow you to see if someone has learned something or not. If I can have the next slide, please. So since I don't have forever for us to talk about it, I thought I'm just going to share with you a couple of important things about learning and memory, and then allow you to ask questions. So the first thing I want to share with you is that associations seem to be critical in memory. Now, I started my story with Simonides and how he had made an association between individuals in the room and the places in which we're sitting. And we understand now that one of the things that kind of helps or aids our memory are, in fact, to make these associations. And one of the first people to really bring this forward was William James. And you'll see a picture of him and his famous book on the principles of psychology. He's thought in many ways to be one of the founders of modern day psychology. He was a professor at Hartford. And he helped us understand that, you go to a dance and you associate the music with the smells that you had if this was a dinner party, perhaps with the person that you were sitting and talking to. And all of those associations are part of what helped form that memory. And sometimes if you're put back in a situation where you have that same smell or hear that same piece of music, it starts to bring back all the other parts of that memory that were associated together in your brain. Next slide, please. Another concept I want to leave you with is a bit about the timing of memory. So this is just showing us, very visually here, that there's a learning phase where you're acquiring the information. At some point, you know that you've memorized something because during a retrieval process, let's say you had a test, a little bit later, you're able to retrieve the information that you acquired or learned. But in between, there's this phase called consolidation, in which you're kind of laying down the memory pattern in your brain, if you want to think about it that way. And there, the memory is a little fuzzy and it's being formed. And this particular slide is showing you that sleep, and particularly slow wave sleep, is particularly important for consolidation. So when my students ask me, should I stay up all night learning for the test in a couple of days, or should I get some sleep? I hope that you can see what the obvious answer would be for me. Consolidation happens during that slow wave sleep period. And so if you want to retrieve stuff for the long term, getting some sleep makes a difference. If I can have the next slide, please. Another thing I want to share with you is that our memories are so good, and we really should be impressed by how much we can remember. At the same time, our memories are subject to interference. And that is particularly true during the consolidation period. So this is just showing you, how much maybe you need to think about relying on eyewitness testimony, because you can interfere and contaminate memory by how you ask the question. You can interfere with memory if you're under a lot of stress. There are all kinds of things that do interfere with our normal memory, and as good as our memory is, it is not perfect and it is not infallible. If I can have the next slide, please. Another thing that I want to emphasize, because as you heard, I'm a neuroscientist, Dr. Ghosh is a neuroscientist, and we know and understand that much of what we refer to as learning and memory is happening with changes in cells in the brain that are called neurons. So just because I think this is such a pretty picture of a region of the brain called the hippocampus, I thought I'd show you a picture of one of those structures in the brain and some of the cells or neurons in which people think some of the memory is captured or consolidated if you want to start thinking about things, next slide, at a cellular level. So as I speak about memory and share with you different stories about memory, I thought that I would share the story of Brenda Milner. She is often thought of as the founder of neuropsychology. And one of the major findings that she was able to share over her 50+ year career is that specific brain regions, if I can have the next slide, please, are associated with certain types of memory. And she discovered this with a patient and a surgeon that have their roots right here in Hartford. So the surgeon, William Scoville, who is on the right, was a surgeon here in West Hartford. And the surgery that I'm talking about happened right here across the street from Trinity at Hartford Hospital. He talked to a patient, and we referred to the patient as HM. And this patient had a biking accident as a child that left him with uncontrollable epileptic seizures. They were so debilitating that he would do almost anything to get rid of these epileptic seizures. So Dr. Scoville, the neurosurgeon, had heard about a new technique in which he would actually, resect or take out the part of the brain that seemed to be associated with the epileptic seizures. And that brain region was called the hippocampus. So during neurosurgery, he removed bilaterally on the two sides of the brain the hippocampus. And it did, in fact, reduce the seizures for HM, but he could no longer make new personal episodic memories, the memories that are really kind of your scrapbook on your life. So Brenda Milner tested over the course of 50 years HM to understand what kinds of memories were preserved and what kind were lost, and helped us understand the association between this region of the brain, the hippocampus, and what we're referring to as the kinds of personal memories that help you remember your life. 50 years, Brenda Milner came and tested HM, and he never remembered from session to session who she was. Think about if you were losing the ability to form new memories and associations. Interestingly, he was able to remember things from 5 years before the surgery and people he had met and known then. But this formation of new memories, how do you build relationships when you don't remember whether you've seen the person or not? Next slide, please. I think it helps you understand when I say, how much of our lives and who we are is really captured by our memories. So here is a quick summary of what I have tried to share with you in the last, 25 or 30 minutes. The first, place, remembering place can help facilitate memories. It can help you make associations that help you memorize sometimes long stretches and accords of things, or think about Simonides, who was able to place each and every person that was in the room before the collapse of the ceiling. I've tried to share with you that you really can improve your memory, but you have to pay attention to it. And if every time you want to try and recall something, you pick up your cell phone, that's not giving your incredible memory the opportunity to get better, expand, and grow. So use that memory sometimes. It'll help. I also shared with you that stress and people can suggest and interfere with memory, and that's particularly true during consolidation. And I've tried to share with you that specific regions of the brain, I happen to talk about one called the hippocampus, are associated with particular kinds of memory. So I think that was my last slide. Am I correct? You can see. This is just if offline, and maybe we can copy and paste it into the QA. If you want to test your memory, there are all kinds of really fun, cool memory tests on YouTube, and test your memory. It's really quite fun. But after I taught this course, I have to tell you, I started paying more attention to my memory, and I do believe as though paying more attention to it, practicing, my memory's a little bit better than it was before I started teaching the course. Okay, so that's my lecture. And I ask now that, Arco, if you want to start the question and answer period off or invite people to put questions in the chat.
Sure, I think everybody should feel free to post questions in the chat. And we already have one by Mikhail. And Mikhail is asking, I think Mikhail is particularly interested in getting memory enhanced. So is there a way to improve that portion of the brain enhanced in individuals who have highly superior autobiographical memory? And also asks about the compounds over the counter that supposedly improve memory. So what do you think about those?
Okay, those are great questions. So I do have them here on my other screen. There are rare individuals who do have, you are absolutely correct, Michael, superior autobiographical memory. But what is interesting is if you look at other kinds of memories, they don't necessarily have superior memories across the board. So that's one thing I want to share with you. It's not as though I have a really great memory for autobiographical things and I remember every second where my keys are. Just not true. It seems as though people do have some people have highly developed types of memory, but it doesn't necessarily spread to other kinds of memory, which is really interesting. There's a quite famous study also about how you can develop your memory better. And it is a famous study about London cab drivers that have to navigate these very, very, specialized streets in London that, kind of change names at the flip of a hat and, change in directions. And that when London cab drivers are tested, they actually have a more highly developed hippocampus, which seems to be where spatial memory is associated, than others. However, if those cab drivers are tested in verbal memory, they're not necessarily any better. And when they stop navigating the streets, they seem to have both a bit of a reduction in some of these brain regions and a loss of that specific memory if they're not constantly using it. I don't know, Arco, do you want to add anything?
No, I'm good because I'm already tempted by the next question, which is posted. And the question is, does persistent smartphone use inhibit memory development, or is detrimental to memory in general, I guess? So what are your views on that?
Right. Cell phone use in particular, no. So if you're asking me about, brain, something being emitted from cell phones, not to the best of my knowledge, but that is very much more a question for you, Arco.
Right, that's why I was kind of attracted to that question.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm going to let you answer that part. I think what I'm trying to suggest is if we constantly kind of externalize our memory and don't use it, I do think we lose some of that ability. So, Arco, please answer that question. What do you think? How would you answer?
So I think perhaps my most informed answer is we actually don't know.
Okay.
Now, very often we make these basic assumptions that this is what would happen in a complex system. For example, if you use memory in a certain way on your phone, you're losing something. But we are quite complicated as creatures, and our brain has many different pathways, many different networks involved. So the outcome we're not certain of until we measure them. However, our lab is really focused on these questions. We actually have an ongoing study right now where we're measuring people's memory, in these contexts. So that what I can already tell you is that some parts of what you think smartphone use does to you does hold up. For example, if you measured your brain's representation of your fingertips, they are larger in users who actually use your smartphones. So it kind of
Yeah.
fits your intuition. However, there's some parts which don't. For example, you would think that people who use smartphones a lot for social activity have a lot of dopamine, but it's the contrary. So we have recently just finished, we just published a study out there showing that the dopamine synthesis capacity is lower when you use a lot of smartphones. So it's a complex system, and we just got to measure and find out. But until then, we can speculate what it does or what it does not.
Great. I learned something.
There's one more question by Thompson, and talks about George Cooper, who had a photographic memory. Yeah. So I think very often as students, we often come across teachers who seem to remember everything, sometimes uncomfortably so. But yeah, so that's an interesting comment. There's one more question by an anonymous attendee. Don't have the name there.
Okay.
So it's about, yeah, so are memories recalled, or memories reconstructions of events, or is the brain replaying equivalent of a movie, or is the brain using fragments of past events to form new memories? A fascinating question. So how do we put it all together?
Right.
When we're collecting something.
Exactly. So that is a fascinating question that, once again, I will start with some of the things that I know, and I'm going to pass it once again to you, Arco, to see how you would answer, interpret it. So a couple of things that I understand from reading about memory is it is not like a movie. It is not that you capture everything that you see or hear. You capture portions of it, but for example, if you are highly stressed, the acquisition, you are interfering with the acquisition of that memory, such that no, it was never fully encoded in the way that you're suggesting here, such that you could never relay it back. The other thing that I tried to share very briefly in the presentation is that, there's this idea of encoding, consolidation, and then for later retrieval of a memory. And I kind of called the consolidation period this kind of fuzzy period where the memory is being laid. Quite interestingly, there's a psychologist in San Diego that does a lot of work with interfering during that consolidation period with memories, and finds that what and how you retrieve can be influenced by what happens during some of those consolidation periods. So for example, if you are asked a question, how fast was the car going when it smacked you from behind, versus how fast was the car going when it tapped you from behind, and you ask that person to recall later, you can pretty much correlate how fast they are going to report based on whether you use the word tap or smashed. So it seems as though you can influence that memory, suggesting it wasn't absolute and it wasn't perfect like a movie, because that person's interference is reflected. Does that make sense? Is the story that I'm sharing make sense? Reflected on what you say, the speed of it, if you were sitting in a witness chair, during a trial. And one thing that was explained to me recently by someone who is much more of an expert on learning and memory than I am is that one of the things that we think is that you encode memory, consolidation to be retrieved later. And every time you retrieve the memory, there's actually a possibility of reconsolidating and restoring it, which means that every single time you retrieve it, it's subject to interference. And I thought that was just a fascinating concept. So that's how I'd respond. Arco, do you have a different or
No, I didn't have a different take on it, but I just want to add one thing which I find as fascinating is the view that, when you're recollecting things, just like the brain does all the time, the brain is really good at filling in the gaps. So I find it really intriguing how the brain can kind of fill in things, even in terms of memory. So there are views, just like when you're seeing an object, some of the parts are unseen, but your brain fills it in. Similarly, there are pieces of memory, that information that you can retrieve, and you fill in the rest and experience it as a whole. And the way that process works is something really, really fascinating to try and understand.
Right.
It's an active area of research. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm being reminded here that the second question was about compounds that purport to improve memory, and I'm going to pass that one to you, Arco, and then I'm gonna answer this one second.
Right. So I think I have very little knowledge about what kind of compounds are over the counter, but I do know that trying to improve the intrinsic ability or the plasticity of the brain in order to improve and accelerate learning or enable learning in cases where it is not possible has been a neuroscientific quest for a long time. And one of the solutions which I have been quite intrigued by is where you observe in development what is going on, and you then try to mimic that in adulthood to see if you can basically recreate the neurochemical and neuronal environment in order to learn things and in order to facilitate learning. But those haven't really made over the counter as yet, partly because the way that you learn things is so complex that if you just douse your whole system in an unspecific manner with such compounds, you'll get kind of in simple lay terms, short circuiting. You might develop all kinds of poor wiring, which can lead to serious neurological conditions. So my view on that is I'm not aware of any over-the-counter aid that is around, but I think the expert here is indeed Joanne. So yeah.
I agree with what you say, and that many of the over-the-counter things that I've seen, compounds related to memory, are things that there is some evidence that memory can be improved, but it is usually in very specific situations at very specific times. So one of those examples is choline. And I've published a lot of papers on choline enhancement of learning and memory, but it is particularly useful early in development when memory is being formed, and much less successful much later in life. So when you just douse your system, as Arco is suggesting, in adulthood with this compound that may have some bit of efficacy when neural circuits are being formed, the likelihood that you are going to see an effect is much lower. Now, the one caveat that I want to share with you, and it is not about over-the-counter medicines, but one of the things that I did as a graduate student was the proof of concept of a drug that became the second largest Alzheimer's drug in the world. It was called galantamine. And for MDs, it's Razidine. I mean, that was its trade name later. And we found that you were able to see memory improvements in Alzheimer's patients, about 1/3 of Alzheimer's patients, for a limited period of time. And I have always thought that many of these pharmaceutics or compounds have the ability sometimes, for a limited period of time, of improving memory when there are some significant deficits and when we understand some of the neurochemical changes that were the root cause. But for long periods of time and more generically, I am not aware of any over-the-counter compounds that have long-term effects. I believe that there is a possibility and potential, but they aren't available right now with the over-the-counter things, because I think that we are going to learn, for example, that new cells, new neurons, have the capacity to build and store memories. And if we figure out ways to stimulate the brain to form new cells and new connections, I do believe that we will have the capacity to improve memory more than we can now. I'm just not aware of any of those compounds available now.
Great, thanks, Joanne. So, I mean, just as a comment, I mean, there's a recent FDA approval of this Alzheimer preventing drug. Can you say a few words about that? I mean, yeah, because quite a different take on from the FDA in terms of what is important.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I haven't spent the time that I would like to really research that compound and the background information sufficiently to have a really strong opinion about it. But it is targeting a particular symptom or output called a plaque in Alzheimer's disease. It is still not clear whether that is a root cause or just a symptom of Alzheimer's. So will it be effective or not? I'm not sure. I was disturbed, and I saw this on Twitter yesterday, so yes, I use my cell phone, that 3 people who were on the approval panel have resigned because that the panel that looked at the drug rejected it, but it ended up being approved overall by FDA. So I don't know, so I haven't taken the time to really investigate that or look back at the original literature upon which it's based. But I certainly have some skepticism, and I'm disappointed at anything that would cost $56,000 a year as treatment.
Yeah, I think costs of these new developments are also remarkable, right? How expensive they're going to be for patients. So we have a question, which I think a question which is typically posed by cognitive neuroscientists, and that is, as people practice memory, which you suggest that improves memory, is that increasing our amount of memory or storage, or improving the capacity to retrieve? So can one specify which part of the memory process is being improved by practice? I think this is a cognitive neuroscience
Absolutely. I'm not sure I know the answer. It's a great question, but I don't know.
I don't know either. So I think this person should spend the time this summer and get a research project going to
Exactly, and get us the answer, because we're certain. I would I'm curious, but I do think that everyone within the normal range has more memory capacity. And I think it was a beautiful thing that came, maybe it's on one of those YouTubes that I watched that Josh Forer did. And he said, one thing that we are sure about is if you pay attention to something, the likelihood of encoding, storing, and being able to retrieve it is much higher. And so the question that we ask is this conversation that we're having, Arco, worth our attention? Because if I pay more attention to it, the likelihood that I will remember it is much higher. And
Right.
the relationships that we have, you know, Josh Bora's final question is, aren't they worth a bit more of our time and attention? Because if they are, we will remember them better.
And I also wanted to point out, I think, even though this question of separating into components is so comforting and academically seems so worthwhile, but again, it's a complex system. And although in our thinking, we might want to separate our little blocks like retrieval, storage, etc., but they might be all kind of really intermixed in complicated ways. It's just an interesting aspect to keep in mind when we try to separate them out in little baskets. John has an interesting question. Is it accurate to say use it or lose it?
Our last question.
It's our last question. You have 2 minutes, so.
Hi, John.
So it's use it. Is it accurate to say use it or lose it applies to health of the brain?
I think using it absolutely helps prevent losing it. You know, it doesn't mean that there won't be some decline of certain kinds of memory with age. I mean, we kind of understand that that for most people, their capacity for these kinds of episodic or autobiographic memories declines with age. Not everyone, but probably the majority. But there is no question, the more you use your brain and memory, the better chance you have of retaining full function. But before I leave, you know, so that's my kind of last statement. I just want to share. Now, for one moment, I have to be president and not professor, and say how impressed and how proud I am of Arco. And he was explaining just a little bit about his research. You heard a little bit about his background and some of the notoriety that he's achieved. I could not be prouder. I wasn't at Trinity when you were here, so Trinity has had a tradition of strong neuroscience long before I took over as president, but I could not be more impressed.
Well, thank you, Joanne, for that. And I think we might have just run out of time. I think it was really entertaining to kind of go back into the classroom and hear all that again. And we have one last question. Too sad, but we are really over time, so we should, I think, probably stop now. And thanks everyone for joining in. And goodbye from Netherlands. So have a good night or good afternoon, wherever you are. Bye, everyone.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us.